I need to clap. You all do so. Dr. Lam Cao, who's on the furthest to the left, was born in Saigon, Vietnam, and came to the United States as a refugee in 1975. As a child who grew up in war, she found comfort in books, in the stories of 1001 Arabian Nights, fascinated by the idea that the narrator saved her own life by engaging in the creative process of telling stories. In the United States, as a refugee, she again found solace in books, in novels such as Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, and in the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, T.S. Eliot, and Adrienne Rich. But it was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye that inspired her to write. In 1996, Professor Cao received widespread critical acclaim for her writing debut, Monkey Bridges, published by Viking, and she has continued to write and author a number of other books, including the 2015 book, The Lotus in the Storm, and the co-author of the 2020 book, Family in 6 Tomes, published by Viking Penguin. She is also the executive producer of a short documentary called On Healing Land, Birds Perch, that tells the remarkable stories behind one of the most iconic Pulitzer Prize-winning photos that explores the continuing aftershocks of the Vietnam War. Professor Cao graduated from Mount Holyoke College and Yale Law School. She has taught at numerous prestigious institutions, including the law schools of Duke University and William & Mary, and is currently the Betty Hutton Williams Professor of International Economic Law at Chapman University Fowler School of Law, where she specializes in, there's a lot of them, international business, corporate law, contracts, international law, international human rights, women's rights, and the rule of law development and its relationship to culture. Her academic monograph on the rule of law, democracy, and culture was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. She's also our only panelist who arrived here and said, because she's coming from California, that it was cold here. So everyone else is like, it's so warm. Dr. Q. Lin Valverde is Associate Professor of Asian American Studies and the founding director of the New Vietnam Studies Initiative at the University of California, Davis. She was a Fulbright, Rockefeller, and Lucy Scholar, and the author of Transnationalizing Vietnam, Community, Culture, and Politics in the Diaspora. Professor Valverde founded the movement Fight the Tower with women of color and in the academy, and co-edited the anthology Fight the Tower, Asian American Women Scholars, Resistance and Renewal in the Academy. As a longtime advocate for Vietnamese Amerasians, she has written about this population since the 1980s, and in fact her work was the inspiration for my eventual work on this topic. In more recent years, she co-founded Tim Lai and the Amerasian Coalition, organizations that serve Amerasians nationally and internationally. Professor Valverde is working on curating an exhibit on development in contemporary Vietnam through the lens of Vietnam's national dress, the Ao Dai. She is also working on her third manuscript, National Aesthetics, which examines national re-imaging projects with a focus on Vietnam's development in sustainability and sovereignty. Her research project for the last 10 years looks at spirit realm beliefs and the history of its exclusion from the U.S. Academy, as well as the importance of its return. You can find more on Professor Valverde on her website, qlin.com. If you would please give a round of applause to our panelists. Okay, so this is a round table, so it's different than a panel, obviously, and what that means is this is more of a discussion. So I'm going to begin by having our panelists talk about a few specific kind of questions that I've already formed, but the goal of a discussion is to have a discussion. So we really look forward to having questions from the audience and engagement from the audience. So a lot of the time will be reserved for that. I'm going to start, however, by asking both of our panelists to discuss their work and or experience regarding or as a child of the Vietnam War, and to kind of talk a little bit about how the war affected the children either at the center of your work or your own lived experience. And I'll start with Lam, if that's okay.
Well, my work, as you described, is mostly in law. And it's mostly in corporate law, securities law, and some international law. So the part that deals with Vietnam is not really in my academic work. However, because Vietnam is a very psychological minefield for me. I use the form of fiction or memoir to deal with that. And I think of it as a kind of, my normal, ordinary academic work is like the surface. And then anything related to Vietnam, including children of war, is submerged. It's more like the riptide. It's more like the turbulent stuff underneath the ocean that normally I would only deal with in my own private time and not in my professional capacity. So, having grown up during the war, the impact, because I grew up as a child during the war, and I've thought a lot about the relationship between me and my parents, and between me and my own child, because I'm sandwiched in between. And I do remember that, because I grew up in Saigon, it's for the most part, until 1968, the war is distant. You hear it, but when it actually came right to the neighborhood was in 1968. And I actually grew up in Chalung, which is a Chinatown section of Saigon, and that was where the fiercest fighting during Tet 1968 took place. And one of the main reasons is that our house was very, very close to the Futar racetrack. And since I came to the US and basically decided that I was gonna read everything that I could get my hands on that has been written about the war, I studied the Futar racetrack, and I understood that it was a place that was fought over by, that both the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese and the Americans fought to control this racetrack during '68, was because it's a flat area that could be a landing zone for helicopters, and so if you can control that, you could control a lot of the administration and the control center of the fighting in that area. So as a result, in '68, suddenly the war came right to the neighborhood. And after that, and it really shook me, and you realize that sometimes things that are distant, meaning it's not as if your house necessarily is bombed, but as a child, when you feel the violence, but you don't understand it because it's far away, it is a phantom. It becomes a ghost that forever follows you in your life. So if you were witnessing it directly, traumatically as an adult, for example, many people in my family were fighting in the war. And it felt to me like they seemed to be less affected than I am, even though how the war affected me was more indirect. And I've often wondered, is it because as a child, you know that ominous things are happening, but you don't quite understand. And so it becomes almost like a boogeyman that all your life you're trying to figure out. And my mother also, I'm not sure why she did this, but she often volunteered to go to a hospital. It's a military hospital called Cộng Hòa Hospital. And she would go maybe from 6 to 8 a.m. as a volunteer to visit all of the wounded Arvin soldiers. And she would take me before school started. So I would wake up with her at 5, by 6 we're at the hospital. And I have to say, the visual of seeing very young, they were 17 or 18, amputees and burned. It's something that you really, really just cannot forget. And I even remember years later, I was on a cruise in Alaska, and I was a luxurious cruise, and there was a person that showed up in the hot tub who was an amputee, and I immediately basically lost time. And I then realized, my God, this stuff is very psychologically powerful. So when I raised my daughter, you know, I think she inherited a lot of the stuff. And unlike my mother, I am much more willing to talk. My parents never talked. In fact, when they arrived, they said, put down, this is now a new Iron Curtain. Never look back. And it's only through literature, really, that I could look back. You know, and when you read something like something that Faulkner said, the past is never gone, it's not even past. Do you realize that? And you know, I found a diary that my mother wrote after she died. And she talked about how when she was pregnant with my brother, she was on a bus, and the bus was attacked by the Viet Cong. And you know, her brother was a Viet Cong also, so our family was very divided. But the bus was attacked by the Viet Cong, and because she was pregnant, the bus drivers and the guide, because there was a roadblock, so they were stuck. They said, lie down and we will cover you. So everybody on the bus died, except my mother. And the insurgents thought that everybody had died because she was underneath these two people. She ran to the riverbank and hid underneath to make sure that they didn't come and get her. And there were leeches all over her body, right, in the riverbank. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, because my brother, his life was very chaotic. And she said it was because of the gunfire that he had heard when she was pregnant. And during that time, when she said it, this was in the 70s, because he was struggling. She was trying to explain why he was struggling. And my father was much more strict. My father was saying, you're enabling him by saying that his struggle is from trauma. He should just get his act together. But now, there is so much research done on how trauma can be inherited through even the DNA. So only by reading more books did I understand, you know, because when my mother said it, I think it was more, she didn't read any research, but she just felt that she was so traumatized and she felt him kicking. So he must have been traumatized as a fetus. And the whole family belittled what she said, because the family was saying, yeah, you're not pushing your kid. You're making excuses for him. So in any event, you know, all of this is something that I carry, and I'm very willing to talk with my daughter about it. And that's why we wrote the book, Family in 6 Tones, together.
You can PTSD. Just joking. But yeah, so I am also a child of war. I was in Vietnam until just before 1975, and then that's when my mother, who was living in the United States at the time, came and got me. I'm a child of multi-generational mixed race, so both my mother and my father are Eurasians from the French era, and all the way to my paternal grandmother. And so I was, just before coming here, my mother called me and said, you know, I'm hearing around that you're going, talking to press, media, about your family history, and I want you to stop. And so I said, well, in what particular are you worried about? And she said, this is the part that, you know, how you were born, and my background. And so I said, I'm proud of you. My mother had me out of wedlock, and I said, that's not your fault, and I'm proud of you. You struggled, you managed, and you left the country early, and you came back for your daughter. I'm not ashamed. make sure we don't talk about our family. So I wasn't planned, that's not, I'm here to talk about aberrations, but because she said that, and as a child, I have to rebel and talk about the family. But since she said she's not ashamed of it, I'm definitely gonna talk about it. So my mother, Eurasian, in Yajan, my father was a handsome, mixed race, northerner pilot, and we got together, and then I was born, and it was very crazy. So my first years, I actually grew up in a village in Yajan, and a lot of really intense stories about coming back after 50 years to the village that my mother wouldn't allow me to come back to because it just reminds her again of things. And so my father didn't want me to grow up in a village, and so he insisted that I was raised in the city in District 3 when I was several years old, and that's where I moved, and I was raised by my paternal side of the family. And so I lived very well, and I had a good childhood, and with loving grandparents and a very big extended family of aunts and uncles and cousins all my age. And we never talked about it, but they all looked like me, except I was the mixed race one, and they were not. Because it wasn't until my grandmother was 80 that she confessed to us what we already knew, which is she's mixed race, because she looks mixed race. And but it was interesting, not having my father necessarily there. My mother was abroad, studying, etc. And I felt alone, even in a loving family in Yajan, and then in Saigon, I felt alone. And ultimately, my grandparents retired in Duduk, which was the countryside back then. It's a whole city now. It's actually a city. And one of my favorite things to do was, I'll tell you a little story. It gives you a sense of my childhood. I often would go to a little shop down the dirt street, and in there they would sell Ritz cookies, Ritz crackers, which is from the PX, I learned. And so they would sell it by the cracker. So to this day, I'm addicted to Ritz, and it's my comfort food. But I went and I bought these crackers. However much money I had, I would get as many crackers. And then I saw rolling up a black sedan, and I saw a woman coming out, beautiful, like a movie star, and she was my mother. Up to this point, I must have been maybe 4 at this point. I'd never seen my mother before, because my mother had left me with my paternal grandparents at the insistence of my father, and she thought that was the best for me, being in a family of privilege, of the intellectual family, etc. And she said that she would stand outside we had a storefront, and she would stand outside and look at me in those weeks and months after she left me, and just cry, and just see me playing on the sidewalk, and my aunts playing with me. She would just cry, and she just felt that that's what she needed to do. In any case, this woman comes out, my mother, and I'm calling her name. But then she gets into the sedan, and she drives off. And I'm calling her name, Ma'am, 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 and I'm running down this dirt road. The dirt is coming up from this black sedan, and it speeds off, and I'm unable to chase it anymore. And I stood there, and I stood there as a child, frozen, shocked, sad, and angry. And I said, from this point on, I don't have a mother. Okay? And fast forward 50 years later, I tell her the story. I've written about it, I told her the story. And she said, that wasn't me, right? I was never in a black sedan. I said, probably not, but for decades I thought it was. And so if you wonder why I was angry at you all the time, it was, stemmed from that point of wondering why you left me, why I only knew you through images and gifts from the United States. And then you came one day when I was 5 and took me to the United States. You were a stranger, And she said, yeah, it wasn't me. I said, yes, I know. And she goes, but I was in Vietnam. I wasn't always abroad. And I said, okay. And she said, but when I was in Vietnam, I never came to see you. And I said, why? And she said, because people gave me bad advice. They told me to leave you, and they told me to don't come back and let you be. And so these are just examples of ways in which we were, alone in different, capacities. And then later I would find out that, and so I lived with my aunts, my single aunts at the time, so the married aunts were more or less off, and then I lived with the single aunts. And I found out later that one of them could never marry because they thought I was her child that was born from American GI. And so she could not marry. So my father's actions, things that were happening, had this rippling effect in our family. And yeah, so it was just a difficult path, and then coming to the United States with a stranger. And not only that, but I was raised, for those who understand Vietnamese and Vietnamese culture, I was raised in a northern family by elderly, very proper. And my mother is this bohemian from Nha Trang, very southern, and central. And I was constantly correcting her, telling her how to act properly, and she was always like saying, wow, this northern princess, kind of thing. But yeah, so these left effects, and like your story of what affects you when you're young. Another quick memory when I stop is I went to a funeral when I was very young in Saigon, and so I must have been 4 or something, 3, 4. And as we're passing a grave, I saw 2 photographs, very small photographs, of children my age. And I remember being frozen again and looking at it, being very confused of how people my age can be dead, can be buried. And I think that was the beginning of my obsession with death, really, and spirit, and ghosts. And it followed me, and it really still, really gives me a lot of questions and answers. But it's those seeing an amputee, seeing images of young people because of war or whatever else, that leaves a lasting effect. Yeah.
Thank you both. I'm wondering if we could zoom out a little bit and thinking about, in hindsight, from where you sit now, maybe you could talk a little bit about the ways that you think the war itself changed ideas of what it meant to be a child, right? So I'm thinking about the assumptions that the characteristics that we put on childhood, like stability, naivete, innocence, fun, right? And thinking about kind of how war ruptures or doesn't, those things, and how that actually changes what it meant to be a child in Vietnam, perhaps a child who's then dislocated from Vietnam and coming to the United States. Can you both talk a little bit about that, Lynn?
I think the idea of childhood, even without the war, I think the Vietnamese idea of childhood is in many ways very different from the contemporary Western idea of childhood. Maybe it would fit more with maybe pre-industrial Western ideas, right? Which is that children are not, they should be taken care of, but it's not as if the parent should be there for them in a way that is a coddling or comforting. It's just like, I'm doing my duty by you, and I've provided for you. And the notion that you're going to create memories with your child, I don't think is a very Vietnamese idea. Which is not to say that the parents don't love you, but they love you through very different gestures. And if you add the war into that pre-existing framework, and because what that means is that many Vietnamese parents during the war were very obviously preoccupied with the war. The men were drafted or in the war in some other capacity. And the mother is often the main breadwinner. So as a result, the child is very much kind of outsourced to either other family members or a nanny, who can be very loving as well, but it's not your usual understanding of a kind of carefree childhood. And also in my case, because I had a big uncle who actually was very close to the family, the notion of secrecy became a part of being in that family. Like, you were told, do not mention this to anybody. Do not mention that you have a big uncle. And I remember, so like, to grow up with a lot of mystery. Like, you don't understand where this violence is necessarily coming from. Even though, in my case, I probably understood more because my parents were very, even though they didn't talk about emotion, they were very interested in talking about geopolitical stuff. So it's fine at the family dinner to talk about current events. This happened, there was an attack in Hue today. So we knew about all that, but never about deeply personal stuff, right? And then on top of that, the fact that I had an uncle who was a very active Vietcong, who had children that he left because he was joining the guerrillas, and the rest of the family raised these children. And I remember one of his oldest son later joined the equivalent of the Navy SEALs here in the South Vietnamese Army. And he came to visit us and his son. And he was extremely upset that the son not only had joined ARVN, but joined this elite battalion group, this group. And I remember seeing him with a butcher knife chasing the son around the table. Because how could you be on the side of the ARVN when your father is a Vietcong? But my cousin never even knew his father because the father was distant. So we grew up with these very non-childhood-like events, and then we're also told, don't tell anybody about this because this is a very big secret in the family. And then, as I mentioned, when I was in college and even high school, I started reading everything that I could get my hand on in the public library about the war. And one of the books I read, this was in the 1980s, and it had just come out. It's a book called A Vietcong Memoir, A Vietcong Memoir by Trung Tan. And at that time, I had become friends with a South Vietnamese anti-war activist named Doan Van Toy. And he wrote a book called Vietnamese Gulag. And I read the book, I really liked it, and I called him out of the blue, right? And we befriended. The Vietnamese community was not crazy about him because he was he was an anti-war activist. He worked with Joan Baez. But I became very good friends with him. And he told me about the book by Trung Tan, so I read it. And I saw in the book a mention of my uncle, right? And the book said, because my father was the commander of the airborne troops. I don't remember which battalion, but one of the battalions. And his battalion had captured my uncle. And Trung Nhu Tan wrote that her father told his soldier to let him go and said, how is it that the family bond is bigger than the fight? So I remember very clearly, then I added two and two together, And I remembered that my parents had a violent fight over something. And then I'm thinking it must be over that. Because for him to say to his troops, let this person go, because that's actually his brother-in-law, not his brother, biological brother. It was more my on the mother's side. So there were all these ruptures and fissures and secrets and a kind of distant violence, sometimes violence, but that is more close proximity. That is really a kind of, to me, when I read the poetry of Adrian Rich called Diving into the Wreck, I thought this is a wreck that I would only dive into through literature. And that's why, I didn't really go into a field where my professional life would coincide with the Vietnam War. I thought it would be the sort of thing where I best study it as a wreck. And the best way to study a wreck is always through psychology and fiction and poetry, rather than, for me at least, that I would be able to go into an alter ego, alter state to study it, rather than in the normal, everyday, professional state. Yeah.
I think definitely the theme of secrets is really big. And it's very, very difficult for a young person to piece together their history when you're constantly told, don't talk about it, don't bring it up, be it about the war, family, or mental health, or abuse, So as young people, you're holding so much of the pain of the family, and you're asked as an adult to do so. And I agree with you that it's like children is like from the industrial era, because as soon as I got to the U.S., my baby brother was born, and I was his mother, a 6-year-old raising a baby, and that was completely normal in the Vietnamese context of the time. Now you probably CPS will call you or what have you, but come by. But at the time it was pretty normal, and everyone did it. But I will say that what was really difficult as a young person coming to the United States, again, with strangers, essentially, is that immediately I couldn't make sense of my world. Just little things like my favorite thing in Vietnam was waking up and having the challenge of picking what breakfast I want to eat. So then that will determine what stall I'm going to go to, and then and just remembering the smells of the foods and my family, and then coming to U.S. and going to a grocery store and finding a coconut and getting so excited, and then opening it up and finding that the meat is hard as a rock, okay? And then thinking to myself, goddamn. And then seeing newspapers where Vietnam is spelled continuously, Vietnam, without the separation as we spell it in Vietnam, and thinking to myself, I forgot how to spell the country, my country. I thought it was separated, And then so confusion after confusion, and it just continued all the way to watching my first Hollywood film, and leaving thinking, that's my history, that's my war. I don't even recall being a part of a war when I was there, because we left the city so early, stayed in the countryside, and then I left the country altogether. And so I was very confused, and I was very sad that I could not remember my own history. And so, artists like Quiding, he famously and similarly, as many of us who came in the early 90s to Vietnam would go along this street called Antique Street, and there would be all these photographs on Antique Street, and they were left behind because everyone rushed out of the country, right? But there were boxes and boxes, and oftentimes these boxes would contain one family's history. And so you would see pictures of people having dinner, parties, and then their kids are growing up and going to France to study, and then coming back and raising a family and all this. And then, you know, as for the Queen, who did an installation with these photos, it was for me that, oh, you know, it took me to come back to Vietnam to then remember there was a history that existed there. And then the history that I saw outside watching movies like Platoon, you know, Hamburger Hill, etc., was a just confusing mess of imagery and narratives that weren't my own. And so I would say it was, you know, my childhood was marred with a lot of confusion, and added on to that was I couldn't, my parents had talked to me about the war, politically or otherwise, and so I was left to piece the puzzles together. And it's not just piecing a puzzle of a history, but piecing together a puzzle of my family. And you know, you talk about having, you know, an uncle in the South, you know, NLF, I believe, in Kong, and so it was just, you know, to this day, the only time we get information is when the cousins come together and share stories, and then we make the connections that, oh, that was because of that, that's because of that, and that's how we know our history. It's just piecing together, because we're not supposed to talk about any of this. And as I mentioned, just a week coming here, my mother reminded me again to keep the secrets. Yeah.
I want to add something about some of the topics we talked about. First of all, you said NLF, and I remember when I first came and I saw NFL for the football. I'm like, oh my God, the NLF. Why are they on TV? And why is it associated with a football game? It's very confusing to me. But the idea of secrets. Okay. So children, you know, it's very, very stressful as a child to be told you have to be a repository of secret. And I remember my uncle, who was very close to my mother, he would communicate with her through a peddler who would sell bánh bao, which is a bun, and he would put messages. She was his messenger, and she would just stop in front of our house. And then my mother would come out, and she would offer this to buy, and in there would be a message from her brother about, you know, in fact, he actually even warned us about the 1968 Tet Offensive. He said something big is gonna happen. But the idea that the child is holding the secret is very interesting, because that means that the child is completely compartmentalized. And in fact, what it has done, I think, for children of war, and at least for me, is that because my father also did say, forget everything when you come. Okay? So the compartmentalization already was natural as a child growing up. And then to come as a refugee or an immigrant, most refugees are also compartmentalized, because we have a private world that is inside the house, and then when you go out of the house and you present yourself, you're nothing like you are at home. And even the relationship with your parents switch, because at home they're the authority, but the moment you leave, you speak better English than they, so you are the authority, right? So everything is very compartmentalized. So the process of growing up as a child of war and as an immigrant, I mean, there's a lot of commonality between immigrants and child of war, which is the secret in the compartmentalization. And what you offer to the world is very different. Just like if you were to go to a Vietnamese restaurant, you could get a different menu if you're Vietnamese. But if a white person who is not Vietnamese, who comes, you know, they're not gonna get a menu that maybe have things that only the Vietnamese would eat, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the compartmentalization of children who grow up in war. So as a refugee, you're also very compartmentalized. But I guess my main point is that it doesn't mean. So one of the books I love also by Adrienne Rich is called Lies, Secrets, and Silence. And the title, Lies, Secret, and Silence, is totally, that's not what her book is about, but it really is about children of war and refugees, because it's filled with lies that you present to the world. Also, within the family, there are lots of secrets and there's a lot of silence. You would think that people who have had to deal with that in their own family would make sure not to replicate it with their own children. But I don't think that's necessarily the case, because when that is imprinted in you as a child, even if intellectually you say, I'm not going to do that with my child, and you really try not to, your child can end up saying, you are passing down that legacy that you thought you would not. Because I feel like even with my own daughter, I'm quite compartmentalized, even though I would be mortified to be called on it at the moment that it happened, right? So I don't think it's that because you've gone through it that you've become so wise that you're not going to pass that on. I think because it's second nature, that it is very easy to keep the silence, even when you are actively saying, I don't want to do it. I think it is, you have to work triply hard, even if you mean to not do it, to make sure you don't do it. Because through my conversation with my daughter, she says, well, you're very compartmentalized. And I mentioned, and thank you for mentioning the fact that I worked on a movie, a short documentary called On Healing Land Versus Hurt. It's the first time that we have 3 children of that are triangles of the iconic picture by Eddie Adams, where it's a very famous picture, where there's an outstretched arm by a South Vietnamese general, and then he shot the person, you know, who was Nguyen Van Lien. Right? So for the first time, my friend, who is the director, Naja Lockwood, we convinced the child of the general who executed the Viet Cong to speak about the trauma of being the child of somebody so infamous. Right? And then we tracked down the 2 children of the man who was executed, who's living in Saigon, and we convinced them to talk about what is it like to see, to know their father really only through that image, and a very violent image. And then we found a third person who is not in the picture, but it's the story behind the picture. And so allegedly, this has never been proven, but allegedly the man who was shot, he has been alleged to have been engaged in the massacre of a South Vietnamese family. And the father is a captain in the RVET. And the executed Viet Cong, before the execution, allegedly had killed the whole family. Mother, father, and the siblings. One child survived through the night, and he came to the US. We found him, and he was the Rear Admiral in the US Navy. So it's the first time these 3 people are willing to talk. And the only reason they have not talked is because of trauma. So the children of the executed never really knew their father. But the photograph was enough to catapult trauma onto them, right? And the daughter, of course, lived with the legacy of her father being captured, executed. When they got to the US, they were threatened with deportation. And President Carter gave them a pardon to stop that. And then the Rear Admiral never wanted to talk about it, and in fact, felt that he brought the bad luck to his family. So it's in that one picture, you know, you have children who are suffering all through their lives and never talked about it. In fact, it took us so long to convince them to talk about it that I even told my friend, if nobody talked about it, you could even make a movie that is similar to the Roger Moore movie, not Roger Moore, what's the name of the guy who made the film about the chasing after the CEO of General Motors? Roger and Me.
Yes.
Roger and Me. And because Roger and Michael Moore, I said, you can make a movie about how you have to chase people the way Michael Moore had to chase the GM CEO because he was evasive. And your movie could be about having to chase people who are so evasive about their trauma. But we didn't have to go to Plan B because we were able to convince these three people to come.
So, kind of picking up on the ideas of secrecy and lies and also the trauma, can you talk a little bit about, I think more from personal experience, what the response was when you came to the United States? So I'm thinking more about the ways that children who came to the United States from the war as children, how their experience, what their experience was like and how that perhaps affected them. So, for example, I know with Amerasians, obviously they are the products of war, and the United Nations and the United States, both with all children of war, have a number of programs to bring them to the United States. But for many Amerasians, this proved really confusing, right? Because by the time they get here, they've come here through a program that tells them they're the child of an American soldier father, that they, in all of our laws, except for the one they didn't realize, that makes you a citizen, right? And they are kind of dropped here, and at the time, many of them come, and they're teenagers, and so the assimilation piece is really difficult, and because the US culture is so different in the way that it was going to perceive them. So that, for a lot of Amerasians, I know had a really major effect on the way that they kind of became who they are, and how they lived, and the secrets they held, and the trauma they carried. So would you mind, I guess, first talking, I just realized the time, first talking a little bit about maybe what that experience was like, either on a personal or from a broader view, but also maybe more importantly, perhaps, I'm not sure, but to think about or to talk about a little bit what the legacy then of the war is for those children, for you, and for your children, right? The intergenerational legacy.
Thank you. Well, I mentioned that I was born from Eurasian parents, but because I'm the age of a lot of the Amerasians during the quote-unquote Vietnam War, I was just presumed to be a child of a GI and a Vietnamese woman. And not just that, I remember I was in Berkeley, and I was an activist for bringing Vietnamese language to the university that ultimately was successful. But someone came up to me and said, I know you're a daughter of a prostitute and and a GI, right? And it was another Vietnamese student. And it just was startling because I knew that's what people thought, but to have someone like say that, it was just I'm like, oh, okay, so it's true. People do think that. But Amerasians are a unique group because we don't get to kind of blend in the shadows or keep our secret, you know what I mean? It's like, and I say our because over the years just kind of adopted this, identity that people put on me. And so we are constantly facing the issue that is, as I've written about, is, they judge you because they know that, or they assume that your father is not there, and, they say in Vietnam, a child without a father is like a house without a roof, right? There's no one there to, claim, and have a name and protect you, so on and so forth. And then the mothers are, again, also stigmatized, unfairly in many ways, like my aunt, and even as Lady Hastings talked about, just unfairly in general, being called a barger or a prostitute or those kinds of things. Lacey's work, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she did Catholic Charities, who did a survey very early on in the 80s, and she found a vast percentage of the relationships were very nuanced, and it wasn't as people just assume. But either way, it's really difficult because you're constantly just assume that you don't have family, don't have parents, or they don't love you, or they're from or they're stigmatized, and so you immediately are ostracized. You're ostracized in the community in Vietnam, And post-war there was a lot of punitive measures, so you are very liberally discriminated in just in schools, jobs, and what have you. And then in the United States, what's interesting is because you're constantly told you're an American, or you're a traitor, or you're a horrible American, you sort of internalize that as young people. You're like, okay, I'm American, obviously I'm black looking, European looking, or what have you. And then when you get to the United States, you don't know any English, you are culturally Vietnamese, and so it is just this, oh my God, I'm not American. And then on top of that, there's different kind of Americans. There's African American, Latino American, whatever. And so culturally, you're not even in any of these groups, And so it makes it even that much more difficult. And because you were kept out of educational opportunities, training, etc., when you come to the United States, you don't have oftentimes the proclivity to do a lot of the, pick yourself up in your bootstrap kind of refugee mentality, because there's already that stigma, right? There's already that history of not being able to have some education, etc. And then on top of that, if you choose to be within the Vietnamese American community, then you're still ostracized. You're at the periphery, right? And you're constantly having to sort of prove yourself. And so actually, I wrote an article doing the mixed race dance, and it kind of leads to what I want to talk about, which is that young people, be it children or teenagers, are often talked about that they don't have agency or they don't have understanding. And as we talked about, we thought a lot as a young person. We couldn't make sense of a lot of things, and it took decades to sort of piece things together. But we are thinking, we're feeling, and so for Amerasians, inherently, because I grew up, being perceived as Amerasian, I knew what people thought of me when they first meet me, and it really came with a series of questions, like who's your father, who's your mother, are you from the French era, from the American era? They listen to your accent. Oh, okay, your Vietnamese sucks. Then obviously you came over a little bit earlier, that kind of thing. Versus if your Vietnamese is good, usually that's a good thing, but not for Amerasians. And then so Amerasians are very clever in that early on we knew how to answer so that we can land more positively, on how people measure you, particularly in the Vietnamese American community, so that we would have a better class standing. Because there's no way you can change the race standing, right? You can't change that, but you definitely can change a class standing. So, early on, that's why in part I never mentioned I was Eurasian until much later, because I knew that saying Eurasian would elevate my class. And at the time, I really want to have affinity with the Amerasian group, because I saw them as a group that needed advocacy and needed to be understood better. And there's a lot of stereotypes about their intelligence, about their honesty, and so on and so forth. So so I would say that for Amerasians in particular, is struggling with the society would not give them a chance in various aspects, and they're not even allowed to quietly keep their secret. And so, but nevertheless, as young people, they're very scrappy, and to the point where many of them were activists in Vietnam early on. It was the young Amerasians, that were left on the streets because they couldn't find work, etc., and had to make do, that they were called Boi Dai, which actually just means, dust of life, but that pertains to all the kids on the street. It's not just Amerasians, but it kind of just stuck with Amerasians. And so, but they were like the ones that went up to people, and that the first Americans coming in, the journalists coming in, and politicians coming in the 80s, they would say, hey, take us back, right? You wrote about it as well. Like, take us back, tell the people our story, we're being kept here. Moreover, it was, those coming from the French era, that were teaching the Amerasians, because they were a little bit older, on how to be savvy. So those are some anecdotal things. Just like people don't talk about, I didn't notice that even in this conference, no one talked about how the French sort of handed off the military to the Americans. It was seamless. And people maybe wonder, why do all these Vietnamese have a French accent when we watch these documentaries. Well, that's because they were trained by the French, and then the Americans sort of took over the troops, etc. So anyway, the point is that was seamless with the Amerasians too, and Eurasians, and so yeah, and a story, one of which is like, I'll quickly say, but Jenny Do Dang, who passed away quite recently. She's a little bit older than myself, but she at 18, she tried to pass as Vietnamese, did everything she can to look more Asian in order to go to school, and so she got some education, and when she was 18, maybe a little bit earlier, 17, she literally went into the post office, or the city hall in Vietnam, and said, I'm being discriminated here, you do something about it, you get me to the United States, like I need to be where the Americans are, because I'm not treated right here. So it's another level of a person that does that, even at that young age. And ultimately, they looked at her, they looked at each other like, well, as a matter of fact, there's this policy, the first Amerasian immigration that you can apply for and go. And so immediately when she got to the United States as a teenager, she then advocated for the homecoming, and that ultimately became the homecoming act, which brought as many Amerasians as wanted to come to the United States. And we may or may not talk about how difficult that was, but nevertheless, it was a teenager that demanded her rights, and then advocated for other Amerasians because she knew what they were going through, still back in Vietnam. And then fast forward, Sabrina and I were part of Team Line, and a big part of what we do, we're advocacy and trying to help the rest of the Amerasians in the hundreds that are still in Vietnam because of the bureaucracy and various reasons that still want to come over. So the people who are at the forefront of this activism is like Jimmy Miller, who is Amerasian and spends all of his time, really, even in all his free time outside his 9 to 5, doing paperwork to bring Amerasians over, doing advocacy work in Washington, D.C., being part of organizations, and even bringing Amerasians together at 300, 500 Amerasian galas, so they can come together and see themselves in a positive light, see themselves as community, and see themselves as beyond what people in the community elsewhere have thought of them over the years. And so this is, again, from a young age, advocating as young children, teenagers, and then even as adults. And the reason why they're very motivated to do this is not just because they remember what it was like being in Vietnam and coming to US as very young people, but their children are asking, where do I come from, right? So it's the young people, again, that are pushing those who maybe wanted to forget and maybe wanted to, not try to look for their family, whatever, that are now motivated to do so, and sort of, not using the children excuse, but definitely seeing that the young next generation is pushing them to take DNA tests, pushing them to find their family, pushing them to be active in being a part of the mixed race community. Yeah.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the identity of the children when they come to the U.S. I remember, and this is very different depending on when you arrive in the U.S., I think, and how many Vietnamese there are in the place that you come. So because I have friends who went to settle in a more remote area, their experience is totally different from mine, because my parents, we resettled in Northern Virginia, and we were the very first in that area. And there were a lot of Vietnamese refugees who arrived. And I think there was a sense that it was an invasion, that rather than just, if you are a minority, but you are definitely minority, let's say there's only 2 of you in the city, it's easier to leverage that. So you were talking about higher ranking, right? You can say, oh, the community can think of you as interesting and maybe even exotic, because, oh, this is really interesting, but it doesn't threaten the identity of the community. you know, there's a book called Tipping Point, right? That a neighborhood that has a certain number of minorities coming in, at some point when it tips, where now the nature of the neighborhood may change, those people will be viewed very differently than if you are just a harmless minority of just like one or two that come in. Then you can be exotic and kind of cute and interesting. I think there were many Vietnamese who came to this area. And when I was, you know, I came in and started 9th grade right away. And it was very frightening because high school is already very frightening, especially American high school where it's such a rite of passage. I think it was more of a rite of passage than, let's say, a Vietnamese high school. Because the rite of passage here is everything you do is going to affect, like your grades count. Then it's gonna affect where you go to college. Now, so it's very stressful. And I remember thinking, it was an American vet, because my family had a tiny little import-export store. And there were a lot of American vets who came, and they said that the store was a comfortable congregation for them, because there were other Vietnamese there, and they said that when they were with the Vietnamese refugees, who understood what they went through in Vietnam, they felt more comfortable than with their own American Main Street. And one of the American vets, I remember, told me, because when I first came, I didn't realize the war was unpopular. Right? I only learned about it as I'm reading more in high school and in college, so I didn't know anything about that there was a war at home in the US. So this vet told me, don't tell people necessarily that you're from Vietnam. He doesn't say he fought in Vietnam. So when I was in high school, I often passed as Chinese because I'm thinking, because the moment you mention Vietnam, people have preconceived ideas before they get to know you. Once they get to know you, then I'm feeling like I'm sharing a secret. Okay, yes, we are Vietnamese. Because they'll come home to my house. Very few people came to my house. Those that came, they would see, oh, what's that flag? White with, yellow with 3 red stripes. Only then would they know, but it's hidden for the first few years when I was in high school. And I also noticed that passing was like, I'm gonna be like an ABC, American-born Chinese, but my English was not good. It was very accented, and I was learning English by watching I Dream of Jeannie and Bionic Woman. So it was very tentative. So it cannot be ABC. So clearly, even if you're not Vietnamese, you're still fresh off the boat. So they call you an FOB, which is still better than being a Vietnamese that triggered all kinds of issues for Americans when they hear the word. Now, I have to say that the worst treatment I got was actually from other Asian students, because they are thinking, and I'm just trying to think about why that would be so. And I think they thought that their status, like they have built up a certain image, which is, we are Americans. And because I remember one of them was a cheerleader. And I wanted to be friends with her because this is a high-ranking person. So if I attach myself to a high-ranking person, I would be elevated, right? She wanted nothing to do with it. In fact, she was on the bus with me because we were in the same neighborhood. We would take the bus to school together. She sat as far away as possible from me. And I think it's because even though she is high-ranking, her high-ranking status comes from already being assimilated and secure. And if she has hanger-ons that are tentative and embarrassing, who don't know, like for example, I didn't even know how to open a milk carton when I was at the lunch. I'm like, how do I open this? And you know how you have to have that spout? Was very confusing, and I was so nervous about it that I stopped even going to the lunch because I struggled to open it. So I'm thinking she wouldn't want anybody who is also Asian, who is so embarrassing, and so she's not secure enough to be the bridge for me. And as a result, my English teacher noticed it because I ate in high school all by myself. And she said, come, because her class is after lunch. So she said, you come have lunch with me in the classroom. And she was the one who introduced me to Porter the artist as a young man. And I love the fact that it's an Irish writer who's struggling with the English identity, and I felt this resonates with me. Struggling with identity. I wanted to read, I wanted to write. Maybe because I'm forced to, because I couldn't be a cheerleader, because that's the highest ranking, right? So I could carve out this very solitary route. But I think the issue of Vietnam is different than other wars, because it's not a war. I think a child of war that comes from Vietnam could have a different experience than a child of war from a war that the US was, very patriotic about, right? So I think that's an added dimension that adds to the element of maybe I need to pass. And then being very shocked that the people I wanted to pass as really didn't want that. In fact, it turned out by the second year, the white Americans were more welcoming than the Asians.
Thank you, both. I'm in a place in my own work where I'm thinking a lot about intergenerational trauma, and I think it's really interesting to hear the way that both of you kind of discussed the ways that children from the war negotiated their identities in the United States in a way to prevent triggering people around them instead of taking care of themselves, right? Which goes into the secrecy and the lies and the continuation of that. So I find that fascinating. So I very much appreciate both of your insights. We have some time for questions, so I'm going to allow that. It's a fairly small group, so perhaps you can come to the mic, but you can also just come up maybe and yell very, very hard. However you want to do it, just, yeah.
Yeah, we want you to come to the mics.
Because,
so we can have
because of the video, sorry, come to the mic.
I'll come to the mic.
Thank you.
Oops. I'm Ron Milan from Texas Tech. I enjoyed everything you said. This brings back so many memories. When I came home from the war in '71, I moved to Detroit and I spent most of my time up there. But I moved to Houston, Texas, right during the Alamo Bay problems that we were having down in Galveston. It was such a shock to me. But the additional shock to me was my son graduated from high school down in Houston, and his name is Milo, and I think he was the only one in the top 10 that wasn't named Win. And it really surprised me as a veteran of the war that I didn't notice those things, the great entrepreneurial attitude, the great intellectual, the drive, everything that I wasn't seeing among the Vietnamese people that I worked with. That's on me, that's a terrible thing. But there was also, and I don't know if this is a myth or not, but there was also this excuse that most Americans down in Houston were making about the success of the refugee children, that they were being pushed so hard by their parents, and that it would hurt them later in their lives. And I just wonder if what the research shows about that and whether it's true or not. Thank you.
I think an answer on that. It's called the model minority myth, and we call it a myth for a reason in Asian American studies. But so quick history of that. As I understand it, and as I theorize, the Japanese coming from the internment camps talk about secrecy. They believe that because they were targeted, because they were maybe Japanese or too Japanese, many left the camps sort of saying, let's not speak Japanese, let's not try to mobilize as Japanese, let's try to assimilate as much as possible. And so that meant that, that there was a huge outmarriage, and still Japanese Americans have the largest outmarriage rate for Asian Americans. But it also meant, we have to be the best of Americans. So they did really, they really pushed their kids to assimilate and do well and not really talk about anything other than being an American. And they really set the tone and the ways in which new immigrants were supposed to be in the United States, particularly Asian Americans. And so parents thought to then bought into this idea that they just pushed their kids, then the education would be a pathway towards building first generational wealth, et cetera, And so it's a myth because we aren't all in, I'd love to say Vietnamese people are inherently brilliant, but that's just not the case, you know what I mean? And so it is a myth, and it's a myth really set up as a reaction. They used the Japanese population, but it was really to use as a divide between Asian Americans and other ethnic groups during the Civil Rights Movement. And so it was really to say, hey, look at this group. They're kind of very obedient, they're kind of, quiet, they kind of just go along, get along. Why are you radicals trying to talk about, rights and so on and so forth? So we were a buffer, and for generations after, and arguably until now, my students will say things like, yeah, because of our culture we're better, because of our families that we care about education more, and so on and so forth. But in fact, I grew up in Oakland. I landed in Oakland, and black families raised me while my parents were working, and they put Brill cream in my hair because I had very froey hair, and they taught me about the importance of education. And I lived in Yemen, in my adolescence, and about it was the Middle Easterners and their values and so on and so forth. And so it's like I grew up in diverse communities, and so I understand firsthand being in homes, talking to families that across the board, universally, people want their children to do well. They will work hard for the kids to have education, but it was because of that history and using Asians as a buffer, still using them as a buffer. So we're often told we're the honorary whites, that at times we're not even minority in a sense of privileges to get into schools like affirmative action, et cetera. So it's a complicated answer. Yes, in fact, a lot of the Asian kids did well, but it was also a survival mechanism for themselves and their families, as well as the stereotypes. So if you're told day in and day out as white men, Asian folks, whatever, that you're inherently smart, your family are inherently hardworking, that you're responsible economically, you get a head up, you get a certain amount of privilege, versus being told you're a criminal just by looking a little black boy, they could be seen as violent, criminal, looking at Latinos seen as lazy, etc. It's all these horrible stereotypes that are put onto you as a very young person and follows you through life. That's what happens, yeah. That's my academic comment, sorry.
Yes, thank you, Gillian and Jilan. I think you have been talking about not only our favorite topics of mine, but also something that historians and academics haven't done much about. And I really hope that there will be a lot more work and research about this topic. Okay, and I appreciate, I think both of you have focused on a lot of the psychological effects of being children in wartime and after war, family dynamics, family influence and impact and so on. Okay, I do wish to ask you to comment on another aspect, which is the relationship between children and the broader society. I think one way for us to conceptualize about children in war is that they become an object of competition. Different groups try to get their loyalty. In North Vietnam, for example, the party and the government would have all kinds of programs in schooling and so on, And the same thing in South Vietnam. Of course, there are differences, there is a stronger civil society in South Vietnam, So kids, may belong to a government, organization, but especially in schools. But they may also be like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, they may belong to Buddhist youth, right, or Catholic youth, and organizations like that, right? And I think we have seen that in the U.S. as well, right? A number of kids come and their parents would put them on, Sunday school, not necessarily, so that they can learn like 2 hours of Vietnamese every week, right? And so, and then all kinds of, so I guess I haven't heard that from you, so would you comment on your observation, your experience, with that aspect, just to, so that we have a more round picture about the Chinese experience with the community. Thanks.
I think you're asking for a comment on the child embedded in the wider society. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. So it's interesting, because that's a very culturally embedded issue in many ways. There's a book, which I think is a very interesting book, by I think he's a sociologist called Robert, his name is Robert Putnam, and he wrote a book called Bowling in America.
Bowling Alone.
Bowling Alone, yes, Bowling Alone. And he talked about how civil society clubs like bowling clubs or Boy Scout, Girl Scout, those kinds of clubs, in fact, create a social capital. Right? And societies that promote that also promote trust. And then that is linked with another book by Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called Trust, and how trust, in fact, is a form of capital. We think of capital as like investment capital or financial capital, but social capital creates, oils the social relationships such that maybe you don't need contract law, which has a lot of transaction costs, right? You have to enter into a contract. But if you do business with somebody you trust, right? And you trust them because there is that social capital that exists through informal channels, then you are a high trust society. And high trust societies have greater economic development. And he considers the US to be a high trust society because it's not just about family. The social relationship extend beyond the family. You will go bowling. You can go to church. You can go to mosque. You can go to temple, right? Japan is a high trust society, according to Francis Fukuyama, because if you have a family-owned enterprise, the Japanese CEO is willing to have the manager be somebody who's not in the family, like somebody with the expertise, whereas the Chinese is clannish. It's only going to be within my family, even if the oldest son is not going to know what the heck to do, they would rather keep it in the family. So in many ways, to place that in the context of children and Vietnamese, in many ways, I never was able to be in any club. Not that I didn't want to, but that it was, my parents viewed it as, why aren't you studying? You should just be home and study, and if you're gonna be taking the late school bus. In fact, I had such a bad high school that I didn't even take the regular school bus home, because the regular school bus are all people from my neighborhood, and they were very ostracizing of me. So I stayed behind to learn from the English teachers and take the later school bus home. And the kids that were in the later school bus all stayed because they're in the chess club, the math club, the football, diving team, all high-ranking stuff. And I thought, I should be doing this. But it required family support. And my family was like, no, you just go home and study. And so there was never that ability, to even be more normal, because if the first time I had a baby was in college. We're so insular, and it's all about family. And also keep the secret, so don't be in any club. And it turned out to be a huge deficit, right? And I had a good friend, she wrote a book, and I'm sure a lot of people know about the book called The Tiger Mom in Chua. And she said, my children are not gonna be villager number 1 or villager number 2, right? You are gonna be studying instead of being in a school play. And in some ways, I think that focusing solely on studying rather than being a club is a very big deficit. But the age, my family was focused on the GPA. If you're doing anything that's not gonna help your GPA, you're gonna cut it out. Even though that could lead to greater mental health. The concept of mental health to them is non-existent because they think we went through much worse than you and we're perfectly fine. What do you have to have? What are you upset about? There's nothing for you to be upset about. The whole world is much worse. You don't have any right to be upset. You just study. So in many ways, all of that stuff that would create a social support, social capital, social cohesiveness, it is not, I don't think, it is not treasured in a lot of maybe Asian family, but certainly not Vietnamese family, and not refugees, because it's like GPA. Your class ranking and your GPA is all that matters, not any club you belong to.
That's so true. And the only reason why I convinced my family to let me join a sport and a government was I said, hey, I found out that's how you get into college. And then they're like, well, then do that, and that was great. But I want to talk about, going back to your question, I think that there was an aspect of, I love how you call that, the high-ranking ones, right, the cheerleaders and football players, etc. I was less interested in that, but I definitely, was interested in government and other things. But what I was really interested in at that time was my community, which I was on the periphery because I was a 75er. So a lot of you may know there's rankings, talk about rankings in our community. There are rankings on when you came to the United States, a 75er, boat people, and etc. And so as a 75er and looking pretty different, they called me the Nikon, I guess the American one kind of thing. And so they're like, yeah, she does her mainstream thing because like you were talking about, they were on the periphery. But I nevertheless, and actually I was really jealous of them because they had this thing called Vietnamese school. And they were like, my parents make me go to Vietnamese school. And I was like, I wish I had parents that cared. But, and then I had to relearn it as an adult. Wow, that was no good. But in any case, what I was most interested in is and I just came fresh from the film New Wave, highly recommend for anybody. And that really brought me back to the 80s where it's like Paris by Night. If you're a New Wave or not, or you are into Paris by Night or not, it's a part of your Vietnamese DNA, okay? Because it's part of your family, it's part of what you were experiencing. So if you don't know, New Wave is this really Euro disco that the Vietnamese kind of glammed onto, and we called it New Wave. And there was and all of a sudden overnight we're wearing mohawk hair, big hair, kind of like 80s off the shoulder Madonna looking things, and then we listened to Eurodisco. And I was somewhat a part of that. But I grew up with these kids from the time they were these nerds, fobs, what have you, doing well in school, to kind of rebelling a little bit, looking at like one, from junior high to high school, they look very different, or even from, elementary school and high school, they change. And I was like, what happened to you now, that kind of thing. And they struggled a lot. And what was very clear to me, and so I started actually doing interviews in high school with these same groups, etc. But because I wanted to know how kids who were getting straight A's decided that they could not get along with the people in the high schools, that they did not feel that they belonged. And where they felt they belonged was with each other, listening to this music, being rebellious, finding themselves, finding their identity. So no, they weren't gonna, actually one of them was a star basketball player, but then he left it to hang out with, his friends because he felt more accepted. His team didn't accept him as much. And it was that kind of acceptance that, that became the sort of the gauge, right? The status, what you wear, the new music you're bringing in, the new dance you're bringing in, the car that you could get and stuff in 10 people to go to a party, that became the status. And that became, what you wanted to do and who you wanted to be. And that was a lot because of being very marginalized in a society that tells you to assimilate, but with a thick accent, but with memories of Vietnam, with trouble at home, with absentee parents, and so on and so on and so on, that were working, not because they wanted to be absentee necessarily. It was a sense of belonging, yeah, and really being happy and really getting, you know, that validation you need and coming to terms with their identity, not as American assimilated and not as quote unquote fobs, but something different and in between that was very much a 1.5 gen space to go to. So I would give a plug out to New Wavers.
We have time for one last question, so it's fitting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you for sharing, because you brought me back to my childhood about secrets. You know, secrets